Tax cuts. They're one of the most talked about economic policies. Politicians and economists often claim that reducing taxes boosts economic growth. But do tax cuts really work as well as some people say they do? Today, we're taking a closer look at the theory behind tax cuts, real-life examples, and whether they actually lead to sustained economic growth. The idea behind tax cuts is rooted in something called supply-side economics. This theory suggests that if you lower taxes on individuals and businesses, you increase disposable income, which then encourages more spending and investment. Businesses with lower tax burdens are supposed to invest in growth, create jobs, and boost productivity. Consumers with more money in their pockets are expected to spend more on goods and services, driving demand. Sounds simple, right? Supporters of this theory also point to something known as the Laffer curve. This curve suggests there's an optimal tax rate that maximizes government revenue without hindering economic growth. The idea is that cutting taxes can eventually pay for themselves through increased economic activity. But finding this perfect balance is tricky, and critics argue that the real-world application of the Laffer curve is often overestimated. Let's look at some historical examples. First up, the Reagan tax cuts of the 1980s. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act, which reduced the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 50%. The goal was to spur economic growth through reduced taxation. And indeed, the U.S. economy did recover from a deep recession, with GDP growth averaging about 4.2% annually from 1983 to 1989. But was it all because of tax cuts? Critics argue that the recovery was more due to changes in monetary policy by the Federal Reserve than the tax cuts themselves. Also, the national debt and budget deficits soared during this time, raising questions about the sustainability of these tax policies. Next, the Bush tax cuts of the early 2000s. The Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001 and the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003 reduced individual income tax rates, lowered capital gains taxes, and provided relief for families. While these cuts did coincide with periods of economic growth, they also contributed to rising deficits and increased income inequality. Many economists argue that these cuts disproportionately benefited the wealthy and that the economic gains were not as widespread as hoped. The ballooning deficit also limited the government's ability to respond to the Great Recession of 2008 effectively. Presenter. Fast forward to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 under the Trump administration. This was one of the most significant tax cuts in recent history, slashing the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% and lowering individual income tax rates. The immediate effect? The U.S. economy experienced a growth boost, with GDP reaching 2.9% in 2018. Corporate profits surged, unemployment reached historic lows, and the stock market saw substantial gains. Presenter. But here's the catch. A lot of the increased corporate profit went into stock buybacks instead of new investments in growth and jobs. This means the tax cuts primarily benefited shareholders rather than leading to significant job creation or wage increases. Despite promises of higher wages, wage growth remained relatively modest. So while there was an initial boost, the long-term benefits for the broader economy are still up for debate. And then there's the issue of the federal deficit. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act significantly increased the federal deficit, with projections suggesting it could add about $1.9 trillion to the national debt over 10 years. High deficits can limit the government's ability to invest in critical areas like infrastructure, education, and healthcare. It also reduces fiscal flexibility, making it harder to respond. Critics of tax cuts argue that they often exacerbate income inequality. Reducing taxes for the wealthy and corporations tends to benefit those who are already well off, with limited trickle-down effects. Lower-income individuals are more likely to spend additional income, which stimulates demand and growth. But tax cuts targeted at the wealthy don't necessarily lead to the same level of economic activity. This can lead to greater inequality and a less dynamic economy. So, what's the takeaway? Tax cuts can provide a short-term boost, but they're not a magic bullet for sustained economic growth. They need to be part of a broader strategy that includes investments in infrastructure, education, and innovation. Without these complementary policies, tax cuts alone may lead to temporary gains followed by stagnation or increased deficits.